Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights and journey onto the restless, unpredictable waves of the open sea. But this isn't a tale of adventure or discovery. Instead, we're going to embark on the horrifying last voyage of a plague ship. Imagine, if you will, a sturdy merchant vessel, its sails billowing, cutting through the waves under a seemingly clear sky. You hear the creak of timber, the slap of water against the hull, and the distant cries of gulls. But beneath that familiar maritime symphony, there's an insidious, invisible enemy already on board, stirring silently, waiting to unleash its terror for centuries before the age of germ theory and rapid global communication. Ships were not just carriers of goods and people, they were unwitting vectors of disease, floating incubators that could transport deadly pestilence across oceans and continents. A single sick sailor, a hidden rat in the cargo, a contaminated bale of cloth, any of these could turn a hopeful journey into a nightmare of suffering and death. You probably wouldn't survive a single voyage on a true plague ship. The cramped quarters, the lack of sanitation, the fear, and the relentless march of the disease would quickly claim you. This was a brutal, terrifying fight for survival where escape was impossible, and the only certainty was the grim prospect of a watery grave. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps this little corner of the internet grow, and it lets me know these sleepy historical deep dives are finding their audience. And if you're feeling up to it, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the weathered wooden deck of a merchant ship, its sails catching the wind, pulling you steadily away from the distant shore. The air is fresh, salty, and filled with the cries of gulls as you leave the bustling port behind. Below deck, the hold is packed with cargo, and the cramped crew quarters are bustling with the mundane routines of setting sail. This is the fateful departure, a moment of initial calm and hopeful anticipation, as a ship and its unsuspecting human cargo unwittingly embark on a voyage that will quickly transform into a nightmare of pestilence. The ship itself is a microcosm of the world, carrying not just goods but people from diverse backgrounds, seasoned sailors, perhaps a few wealthy merchants, maybe a family migrating to a new land, or even soldiers being transported to a distant garrison. Each individual brings their own stories, their own hopes, and their own, often invisible, vulnerabilities. What no one knows at this moment is that an unseen passenger has already boarded, nestled deep within the ship's dark corners, in the fur of a rat, in the contaminated provisions, or perhaps carried in the very breath of an unwitting crew member. The port you've just left might have been bustling, perhaps even with whispers of a growing sickness in its poorer districts, dismissed as common fevers or the usual urban malaise. Or perhaps the disease was already dormant within one of the passengers, incubating silently, waiting for the confined, unsanitary conditions of the ship to awaken its full, devastating potential. The air of ignorance is almost as palpable as the sea breeze, as everyone believes they are leaving trouble behind, not carrying it with them. Naval historians and epidemiologists frequently emphasize that ships were primary vectors for the global spread of diseases like the Black Death, cholera, and smallpox throughout history. Due to their ability to rapidly transport infected individuals, rodents, and contaminated goods across vast distances. This made ports crucial points of origin and reception for pandemics. The initial days of the voyage might pass uneventfully. The rhythm of shipboard life sets in, the watch changes. The meals are cooked often from provisions that are not entirely fresh, and the sailors go about their duties. You might feel the gentle roll of the ship, the sun on your face, and the vast, liberating expanse of the open sea. This sense of normalcy only heightens the chilling contrast with what is about to unfold. However, the conditions below deck are already laying the groundwork for disaster. Fresh water is often scarce and quickly grows stale. Sanitation is primitive, relying on buckets emptied overboard, or simple communal privies. The air in the lower decks is stagnant, humid, and quickly becomes foul, filled with the smells of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the confined spaces of human existence. Rats, constant companions on any wooden ship, scurry in the shadows, moving freely between the cargo, the food stores, and the living quarters, carrying their own silent menace. A particularly insidious detail is the long incubation period of many deadly diseases. The plague, for instance, could incubate for several days without symptoms. This meant that an infected individual could board a ship, seemingly healthy, and mingle with the crew and passengers for days before the first terrifying signs appeared. By then, the disease would have had ample time to establish itself within the confined ecosystem of the vessel, making escape virtually impossible. The ship, once a symbol of freedom, transforms into a sealed, biological trap. The ship's design itself inadvertently became an accelerant for disease. The narrow passages, the shared hammocks, the communal eating spaces, the lack of fresh air circulation all contributed to an environment where airborne droplets and contaminated surfaces could easily spread pathogens from one person to the next. You literally couldn't avoid breathing the same air as everyone else, or touching the same surfaces. So, as you quietly reflect on this fateful departure, you begin to grasp the chilling innocence of a ship setting sail, unaware that it carries within its wooden hull the seeds of a horrifying destiny. The calm before the storm is all the more unsettling because you know, as they did not, that this voyage is not merely about reaching a distant port, but about a terrifying, inevitable confrontation with an invisible killer, transforming a hopeful journey into a last, desperate struggle against the spreading pestilence. You've witnessed the chilling innocence of a ship embarking on its fateful departure, unknowingly carrying the seeds of death within its hull. Now, let's peel back the thin veneer of normalcy and delve into the horrifying moment when the invisible enemy reveals itself, symptoms of the scourge. This is about the first terrifying signs of illness emerging among the crew and passengers, turning hopeful anticipation into a rising tide of fear and confusion. Imagine a few days, perhaps a week, into the voyage. The ship is far from land, a tiny wooden speck on the vast, indifferent ocean. You might be going about your daily duties, swabbing the deck, mending a sail, or perhaps just enjoying a quiet moment of sun. Then, a subtle change begins. A sailor, usually robust and jovial, suddenly complains of a headache. Another passenger feels a creeping nausea. At first, these might be dismissed as seasickness, or the usual minor ailments of shipboard life. But then, the symptoms intensify and more people begin to fall ill. The specific symptoms, of course, would depend on the plague in question, but in the confined environment of a ship, they would quickly become unmistakable. If it was the bubonic plague, the infamous Black Death, you might notice the first terrifying signs: a sudden high fever, a profound headache, and an overwhelming weakness that forces the victim to their bunk. Then, the appearance of the dreaded buboes swollen, painful lymph nodes, often in the groin, armpit, or neck, growing to the size of an egg or an apple. Imagine the agonizing pain as these lumps developed, throbbing beneath the skin. A visible, horrifying mark of the internal battle raging within the body. If the ship carried pneumonic plague, the symptoms would be even more terrifying for those on board. This form of the plague attacked the lungs, leading to a rapid onset of severe coughing, often producing bloody sputum. Imagine the horrifying sight of a shipmate, their face flushed with fever, coughing violently, spraying droplets of blood and mucus into the already stale, confined air. This airborne transmission meant the disease would spread with terrifying speed. Each cough a deadly projectile in the claustrophobic space below deck. Epidemiological studies of historical plague outbreaks consistently show that the confined, unsanitary conditions on ships, combined with the presence of disease vectors like fleas on rats, created ideal environments for rapid and widespread transmission of various infectious diseases. Then there's cholera, the Blue Death, which we touched on before. The onset was brutally swift, sudden, profuse, watery diarrhea, and relentless vomiting. Imagine the horrifying stench permeating the already foul air below deck, as victims rapidly dehydrated, their skin turning cold and bluish, their voices reduced to a mere whisper. The speed of its progression, from seemingly healthy to rapidly dying, would induce sheer panic among those still well. The first cases would likely be isolated, perhaps in the cramped forecastle where the common sailors slept, or among the steerage passengers packed tightly below. The ship's surgeon, if there was one and many smaller vessels didn't have a dedicated medical professional, would be called. Their knowledge, however, would be rudimentary, operating under theories like the miasma theory that disease was caused by bad air or noxious fumes. They might prescribe bleeding, purging, or simply advise fresh air, all largely ineffective, and sometimes even harmful. Treatments against microbial infections they couldn't even see. Imagine the desperate, futile efforts to bring down a fever with cool cloths, or to stop the relentless vomiting with harsh purges. While the invisible killer tightened its grip, a particularly chilling, yet common detail was the isolation and fear as more individuals fell ill. A profound sense of terror would begin to grip the ship. Healthy crew members would eye the sick with a mixture of pity and profound dread, knowing that close contact could mean their own death sentence. The sick might be moved to a makeshift infirmary, perhaps a particularly dark and unventilated corner of the hold, or simply left in their bunks, isolated by fear, but still infecting the very air and surfaces around them. The once bustling ship would begin to feel eerily quiet, punctuated only by the groans of the sick and the quiet. Nervous whispers of the healthy. The lack of understanding of germ theory meant that effective hygiene was almost impossible. Shared buckets for human waste, contaminated food preparation areas, and a general absence of regular hand washing meant that every surface, every interaction, carried the risk of transmitting the disease. The ship itself became a giant petri dish, cultivating and spreading the invisible scourge with relentless efficiency. So, as you quietly reflect on symptoms of the scourge, you truly grasp the horrifying moment when hope turned to dread on a plague ship. The first cough, the first fever, the first bubo, each was a terrifying harbinger of what was to come, transforming a vessel of commerce into a floating incubator of death. Far from any land, with no escape from the invisible enemy now consuming its human cargo, you've witnessed the terrifying emergence of illness, the visible signs of the scourge taking hold. Now, let's descend into the truly horrifying reality of being trapped on such a vessel, experiencing life aboard a floating prison. This is about the brutal, claustrophobic existence as disease ravaged the confined space of the ship, turning a vessel of hope into a sealed, inescapable death trap. Imagine the ship's interior, once merely cramped, now transformed into a suffocating, infected nightmare. The air below deck, always stale, would become thick with the smell of sickness, vomit, and human waste, without proper ventilation. The stench would be overwhelming, a constant assault on your senses, a chilling reminder of the invisible pathogens swirling around you. Every breath felt like inhaling poison. The confinement was relentless. Ships were designed for efficiency, not comfort or sanitation. Cabins were tiny, often shared by multiple individuals. the common crew quarters, the forecastle, or the steerage compartments for passengers, would be packed shoulder to shoulder. Imagine dozens of people, some healthy, some desperately sick, all crammed into a single, dimly lit space. There was no escaping the proximity of the dying, no possibility of isolation. You literally ate, slept, and breathed inches from the afflicted, making escape from infection virtually impossible. Maritime historians and public health researchers consistently highlight the critical role of shipboard confinement and poor sanitation in accelerating disease transmission during historical epidemics. Turning vessels into incubators of pestilence, water, always a precious commodity at sea, would become even more critical and, terrifyingly, often contaminated. The limited freshwater supplies, stored in barrels, could easily become tainted by bacteria from infected crew members or from rats. Imagine the desperate thirst, knowing that every sip of water might carry the seeds of the very disease that was consuming your shipmates. Drinking became a gamble with death. Food, too, became a source of anxiety. What little fresh food might have been on board would quickly spoil in the warm. Damp conditions, salted meat, and hardtack, the staples of a sea diet, offered little nutrition to weakened bodies. Food preparation areas, often shared and unsanitary, could easily become contaminated by sick hands or the pervasive presence of flies drawn to human waste. Eating became a terrifying necessity, wondering if your next meal carried the hidden killer, a particularly grim, yet common detail was the disintegration of hygiene, without proper washing facilities, and with fear-paralyzing efforts. Personal hygiene would quickly break down. Clothes would become soiled, bodies unwashed, and the general state of cleanliness would plummet. This created a perfect feedback loop for disease transmission, with contaminated surfaces and unwashed hands spreading pathogens with terrifying efficiency. The very basic human needs for cleanliness were rendered impossible, turning the entire ship into a vast, contaminated surface. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine the constant fear, the gnawing anxiety that you would be next. Every cough from a shipmate, every groan from a bunk, would send a shiver of dread through you. The once comforting sounds of the ship, the creaking of timber. The rush of waves would now be overlaid with the sounds of suffering and death. Sleep would be restless, haunted by the images of the dying and the pervasive smell of sickness. The ship, once a symbol of adventure, became a claustrophobic cage of terror, its wooden walls echoing with the final gasps of its passengers. Discipline might break down as fear took hold. Some crew members might abandon their duties. Consumed by panic or illness, officers might struggle to maintain order as their ranks thinned and morale plummeted. The hierarchy of the ship, once rigid, could crumble under the relentless pressure of a deadly epidemic, leaving the vessel adrift in more ways than one. So, as you quietly reflect on aboard a floating prison, you truly grasp the horrifying reality of being trapped on a plague ship. The confined space, the lack of sanitation, the contaminated resources, and the pervasive fear transformed the vessel into an inescapable death trap, where every living moment was a brutal struggle against an invisible enemy, and the only escape was often a cold, watery grave. You've experienced the chilling reality of being trapped on a plague ship, a floating prison ravaged by disease. Now, let's descend into the agonizing final stages of that horrifying journey, witnessing the physical and mental toll as the sick succumb to fever, pain, and inevitable despair, desperation, and delirium. This is about the brutal, dehumanizing reality of dying on board. Far from land, with no hope of comfort or cure, imagine lying in a cramped, dark bunk, your body racked by fever. The heat below deck would be stifling, the air thick with the smell of sickness and sweat. Your skin burns, yet you shiver uncontrollably. Your head throbs with relentless pain, a constant pounding that echoes with the creak of the ship's timbers and the groan of the waves outside. This isn't just discomfort, it's an all-consuming agony. A descent into a world defined by suffering. As the disease progressed, the fever would intensify, bringing with it the terrifying onset of delirium. Reality would begin to blur, replaced by a chaotic kaleidoscope of hallucinations and confused thoughts. You might see grotesque figures dancing in the shadows, hear disembodied whispers, or believe you are back on land, lost in a familiar village. Your shipmates, even your loved ones, might appear as distorted, menacing figures, their attempts to help perceived as threats. Imagine your mind, once clear, now a battlefield of fevered dreams, unable to distinguish friend from foe, reality from a nightmare. Medical historians and accounts from historical epidemics consistently describe delirium as a common and terrifying symptom of severe fevers, particularly those caused by infectious diseases like typhus, cholera, or plague, profoundly impacting both the patient and those attempting to care for them. The thirst would become agonizing. Your mouth would be parched, your throat burning, your tongue swollen. You would beg for water, but any liquid ingested might be immediately expelled by relentless vomiting or diarrhea, further dehydrating your already failing body. Imagine the desperate, raspy pleas for a single drop of water, the agony of a body crying out for moisture it cannot retain. The pain would be constant and often excruciating. If it was bubonic plague, the buboes would swell to unbearable sizes, throbbing with excruciating tenderness, often bursting with foul-smelling pus. If it was cholera, the muscle cramps would twist your limbs, leaving you contorted in agony. Every movement, every breath, would be a fresh wave of torment, slowly eroding your will to hold on. You would lie there, unable to escape the pain, waiting for the inevitable release of death, a particularly grim, yet common detail was the isolation and sickness as more individuals succumbed. Healthy crew members would become increasingly terrified of contagion. The sick would be avoided, left largely to their own devices, or given only the most rudimentary care by a few brave, or perhaps already infected souls. You might lie there, desperately ill, overhearing the hushed whispers of your shipmates, knowing they feared you, perhaps even wished for your swift end to spare them from the same fate. The profound loneliness of dying in such a way, surrounded by fear yet utterly alone in your suffering, would be a final cruelty. The lack of medical understanding only exacerbated the desperation. The ship's surgeon, if present, would likely be overwhelmed, exhausted, and utterly helpless. Their treatments bleeding, purging, ineffective tonics would do nothing but prolong your agony or hasten your end. Imagine being told there was nothing more to be done, that your fate was sealed, while your body continued its agonizing decline. The hopelessness would be absolute. You might hear the last gasps of others in the bunks around you, the chilling silence that followed, knowing that your turn would soon come. The bodies of the dead would be quietly removed, often wrapped in canvas and slipped overboard, without ceremony. This constant procession of death would serve as a grim reminder of your own impending demise, stealing any sliver of hope that might remain. So, as you quietly reflect on desperation and delirium, you truly grasp the horrifying reality of dying on board a plague ship. It was a brutal, dehumanizing end, marked by agonizing pain, a mind consumed by fevered nightmares, and a profound, terrifying loneliness. All played out within the confines of a vessel that had become a floating tomb. Far from any shore, you've witnessed the physical and mental toll of disease, the agonizing descent into desperation and delirium aboard a plague ship. Now, let's confront one of the most grim and heartbreaking necessities of such a voyage: graves in the grasping waves. This is about the brutal reality of sea burials, the hurried, often unceremonious farewells, and the profound finality of consigning the dead to the cold, indifferent embrace of the ocean, far from any hallowed ground. Imagine the ship's surgeon, or perhaps the captain, making the grim pronouncement another life has been lost in the cramped, infected confines of a plague ship. Death was a frequent, unwelcome visitor, unlike on land, where bodies could be prepared, mourned, and interred in consecrated ground. The sea offered no such comforts. The priority was containment, preventing further spread of the deadly contagion, and that meant the dead could not remain on board. The ritual of a sea burial, in such desperate circumstances, was often stark and swift. The deceased, typically wrapped in a simple canvas or sailcloth shroud, would be sewn tightly into their makeshift coffin. Sometimes, heavy weights, cannonballs, stones, or bags of sand would be secured to their feet, ensuring they would sink swiftly to the depths. Imagine the grim efficiency of the remaining crew, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and fear. Performing this last duty, their movements precise and economical, born of grim necessity. Maritime historians and public health records from historical epidemics indicate that sea burials were a common and necessary practice on plague-ridden vessels. Driven by the imperative to prevent further contagion and manage the increasing number of deceased individuals on board, the funeral service itself would be brief, often just a few hurried words from the captain or a surviving shipmate. If any were still well enough to speak, there would be no hymns, no eulogies, no comforting prayers from a priest. The fear of contagion and the sheer volume of dying would strip away most ceremony. You might hear the quiet splash as the body slid over the side, followed by the chilling gurgle as it plunged into the dark. Churning depths, forever lost to sight, a particularly grim, yet common detail was the sheer frequency of these burials. As the plague swept through the ship, bodies would follow one another overboard with terrifying regularity. Imagine standing on deck, watching body after body consigned to the waves. Day after day, the constant reminder of death, the chilling regularity of the splashes, would serve as a grim countdown, deepening the despair and paranoia among those still clinging to life. The ocean itself became a vast, unmarked graveyard, its waves tirelessly receiving the sick and the dying. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. There was no closure. The dead were not laid to rest in a familiar grave, where loved ones could visit and mourn instead. They vanished into the endless, indifferent ocean. This lack of a tangible resting place, combined with the brutal circumstances of death, would leave deep emotional scars on those who remained, haunted by the images of their shipmates disappearing beneath the waves. You might later dream of the cold, dark waters, forever holding the bodies of your lost companions. The fear of the contagion often meant that even personal effects of the deceased were thrown overboard, or simply abandoned. Belongings that might have provided a shred of memory or comfort were deemed too risky to keep. Further severing the ties to the departed, the emphasis was entirely on survival, on cleansing the ship of anything that might harbor the invisible killer. For the healthy few, each burial was a desperate act of self-preservation. Getting rid of the infected bodies was seen as vital to stop the spread, a desperate attempt to cleanse the vessel of its deadly cargo. But it was also a stark reminder of their own precarious position, knowing that their turn might be next, their own final resting place destined for the same cold. Watery oblivion. So, as you quietly reflect on graves in the grasping waves, you truly grasp the horrifying finality of death on a plague ship. It was a brutal, unceremonious farewell, a necessity born of desperation and fear, where the vast, indifferent ocean became the final resting place for countless souls, far from land, forever lost to the silent, grasping waves. You've confronted the harrowing reality of sea burials, bodies consigned to the indifferent waves. Now, let's consider the relentless struggle of those who remained, desperately trying to keep the vessel moving while facing unimaginable horrors the crew's grim fate. This is about how the ship's limited, often terrified. Crew battled not just the spreading pestilence, but also exhaustion, despair, and the breakdown of order, turning their roles as sailors into a relentless fight for survival. Imagine yourself as one of the surviving crew members on a plague ship. The initial fear has morphed into a chilling routine. Each day brings new sickness, new deaths, and new burdens. Your ranks are thinning rapidly. A watch that once required 10 men now falls to 5, then 3. The physical demands of sailing a ship trimming sails, manning the helm, pumping bilges remain constant, but the available hands shrink with terrifying speed. You are perpetually exhausted, your muscles aching, your mind dulled by lack of sleep and constant dread. The overwhelming workload was relentless, with fewer healthy hands. Every task became a monumental effort. Hauling lines, raising sails, navigating the ship, all while nursing the sick and disposing of the dead. It was a brutal, non-stop physical and mental assault. You might spend hours struggling with a heavy sail, your body burning with fatigue, knowing that if you faltered, the ship itself and everyone on it could be in peril. The sea was unforgiving, and the plague made it even more so. Maritime historians and public health scholars consistently note the severe strain placed on ship crews during historical epidemics, often leading to a breakdown in discipline, exhaustion-related accidents, and increased mortality due to both disease and the inability to perform essential tasks. Then there was the profound psychological toll. Imagine being constantly surrounded by sickness and death. The groans of the dying, the stench of decay, the sight of bodies being slipped into the sea, these would become your daily reality. The fear of contagion would be omnipresent, a silent companion in every cramped corner of the ship. Every cough, every sneeze from a shipmate would send a jolt of terror through you, wondering if you were next. This constant, pervasive anxiety would fray your nerves, leading to paranoia, irritability, and a creeping sense of despair. Discipline and morale would inevitably break down. The rigid hierarchy of a ship, vital for its operation, could crumble under such extreme pressure. Officers might fall ill or become overwhelmed, their authority eroded by fear and helplessness. Crew members might refuse dangerous tasks, or hoard what little fresh water and food remained. Mutiny, though rare, could become a terrifying possibility if despair became too great. Imagine witnessing the very order of your floating world dissolve, replaced by chaos and self-preservation, a particularly grim, yet common. Detail was the lack of medical support. On smaller merchant vessels, there might be no surgeon at all, leaving the remaining healthy crew to improvise care for the sick with rudimentary first aid knowledge and ineffective folk remedies. Even if a surgeon was on board, they would quickly be overwhelmed, running out of supplies and facing an impossible task. You might watch your shipmates die, knowing that there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to help, simply waiting for their inevitable end. The helplessness was profound. For both the sick and the diminishing numbers of healthy carers, the isolation was absolute. Far out at sea, there was no escaping the epidemic, no port to flee to, no outside help to call upon. The ship became a sealed environment, a self-contained nightmare. This total isolation deepened the sense of hopelessness, making every day a desperate gamble against an unseen, relentless enemy that could not be outrun or outmaneuvered. You were truly alone with the plague. Even the task of disposing of the dead would become increasingly arduous. As more crew members succumbed, fewer hands were available to perform the grim work of sewing shrouds and carrying bodies to the rail. The physical exertion, combined with the emotional trauma of burying your comrades one after another, would be immense. Each splash of a body hitting the water would echo with profound sorrow and the chilling realization of your dwindling numbers. So, as you quietly reflect on the crew's grim fate, you truly grasp the horrifying reality of being a sailor on a plague ship. It was a relentless battle against unseen forces, compounded by overwhelming physical demands, profound psychological torment, and the desperate breakdown of order, turning a demanding profession into a desperate, often futile, fight for survival against the relentless march of pestilence. You've explored the grim struggle of the crew, battling disease and despair on board a plague ship. Now, imagine that wretched vessel, still clinging to its desperate cargo of sick and dying. Finally sights land, but instead of relief, it encounters a new, terrifying ordeal unwelcome at any port. This is about the horrifying reality of quarantine and the often brutal refusal of safe harbor, turning a desperate plea for aid into a chilling sentence of isolation and further suffering. Imagine the collective gasp of hope that ripples through the few remaining healthy crew and passengers as a distant shoreline appears on the horizon. Land salvation. The thought alone would be a balm to their fevered minds and aching bodies. The captain, perhaps weak with illness himself, would direct the ship towards the nearest port, desperate for medical aid, fresh supplies, and an end to the nightmare. But as you draw closer, the scene that unfolds is not one of welcoming docks and bustling markets. Instead, you see signals of warning flags being raised, cannons perhaps loaded, and small, swift boats darting out, not to guide you in, but to keep you away. The news of your ship's affliction, or even just the suspicion of it, would have preceded you, or be quickly deduced by the sight of your listing vessel and gaunt, desperate crew. Public health historians confirm that the practice of maritime quarantine, while often harsh and imperfectly applied, was one of the earliest and most widespread forms of epidemic control. Evolving from medieval practices like the 40-day isolation period quarantina, this was the terrifying reality of quarantine. In an age without antibiotics or germ theory, isolation was the only known defense against spreading devastating plagues. Port authorities, having witnessed the horrors that a single infected ship could unleash upon their city, would take immediate and uncompromising action. Your ship, a vessel of death, was a pariah, a threat that must be kept at bay at all costs. You might be ordered to anchor far offshore, perhaps for days or weeks, a visible but untouchable speck in the harbor. Imagine the frustration and despair. You can see the bustling city, the green fields, the promise of food and medicine, but you are forbidden to approach. The smell of fresh land, so tantalizingly close, would mock your desperate situation. Every day spent anchored offshore meant more sickness, more deaths, more suffering on board. The relief of sighting land quickly turned into the agony of being so close, yet so utterly cut off. A particularly cruel detail was the denial of fresh supplies. You might send a desperate plea for water, for food, for medicine, but it would often be refused or delivered with extreme caution, left on a small rowboat for you to retrieve, with no direct contact. The fear of contagion was so absolute that port officials would risk letting an entire ship starve or die of thirst rather than allow a single infected person ashore. Imagine watching your meager supplies dwindle, knowing that help was literally within sight, but utterly out of reach. Sometimes, if the port was particularly desperate to protect itself, you might even face outright hostility. Armed boats might patrol a perimeter around your ship, with orders to fire upon anyone attempting to come ashore. You were a walking, floating death sentence, and the port was prepared to use lethal force to prevent you from breaching their defenses. The fear of being shot down in the water, after surviving weeks of plague, would be a terrifying final indignity. The psychological toll on the remaining crew and passengers would be immense. Hope, once kindled by the sight of land, would be cruelly extinguished, replaced by a profound sense of abandonment and injustice. You were being left to die, simply for carrying an invisible enemy. This desperate isolation, surrounded by the vast, indifferent ocean on one side and an unwelcoming, terrified shore on the other, would push even the strongest minds to the brink. You might hear whispers from passing ships, their crews shouting warnings, or see flags being exchanged, clearly signaling your pariah status to anyone who came near. The news of your plague-ridden vessel would spread quickly along the coast, ensuring that every subsequent port would greet you with the same chilling refusal, turning your desperate quest for safe harbor into an endless, agonizing cycle of rejection. So, as you quietly reflect on being unwelcome at any port, you truly grasp the horrifying culmination of a plague ship's voyage. It was a brutal sentence of isolation, a denial of basic human compassion, where the fear of contagion transformed entire cities into impenetrable fortresses, ensuring that a dying vessel and its desperate occupants found no solace, no refuge, and often, no survival. From the relentless grip of the plague, you've witnessed the brutal rejection at every port, transforming a plague ship into a desperate, isolated entity. Now, let's contemplate the most chilling fate for such a vessel ghost ship's haunting drift. This is about the horrifying possibility of a vessel left utterly adrift, its crew and passengers all dead or dying, becoming a silent, spectral menace on the open seas. A grim harbinger of pestilence, waiting for its silent current to carry it to an unsuspecting shore. Imagine the ship. Days, perhaps weeks, have passed since it was last seen, since its desperate pleas for aid were met with cannon fire or chilling silence. The sails, once taut with the wind, are now torn and tattered, flapping limply, or completely gone. The rigging hangs in broken strands, swaying erratically with the swell of the ocean. The once sturdy timbers groan, not from the familiar stresses of sailing, but from the insidious work of neglect and the slow creep of decay. There is no one at the helm, no one on watch, no lights burning in the night. It is a vessel abandoned by the living, yet still carrying its grim cargo. The air on board would be thick with the stench of death and decay. The bodies of the crew and passengers, left untended in their bunks or collapsed on the decks, would be slowly succumbing to the elements and the natural processes of decomposition. Imagine the horrifying sight of bloated, discolored corpses, perhaps covered in the telltale buboes of the plague, swaying with the gentle roll of the ship, their vacant eyes staring into the indifferent vastness of the ocean. The rats, the original carriers of the plague, might still scurry in the shadows. Now the sole, undisputed inhabitants of the floating tomb. Maritime historians and epidemiologists acknowledge the historical phenomenon of ghost ships, or derelict vessels, sometimes found with their crews dead from disease, highlighting the dangers of long-distance sea travel during epidemics. While specific documentation can be sparse, the accounts reinforce the terrifying reality of these plague-stricken vessels, a particularly grim, yet common. Detail was the subtle way these ships became vectors of further contagion. Even in their derelict state, the rats on board, carrying infected fleas, could potentially abandon ship if it drifted too close to land, bringing the plague to a new shore. The cargo itself, if it contained infected textiles or other goods, could still harbor pathogens. Imagine such a ship, carried by an unseen current, silently approaching an unsuspecting fishing village, bringing not treasure, but death. The very silence of a ghost ship would be profoundly unsettling to any passing vessel. A ship found adrift, sails torn, no sign of life, would immediately spark fear and dread among experienced sailors. The unspoken knowledge of what horrors might lie within its hull would compel other ships to give it a wide berth. Unwilling to risk contact with such a grim omen, it was a visible manifestation of terror, a floating warning to all who saw it. You might hear whispers among port towns and coastal communities. Tales of a phantom ship, sighted briefly on the horizon, only to vanish into the mist, leaving behind an unexplained dread. These were the origins of many maritime ghost stories, born from the very real and terrifying possibility of encountering a vessel consumed by the plague. Its last voyage a silent, horrifying drift. The line between reality and folklore would blur, as the sight of such a ship became a direct link to the unknown horrors of the plague. The ghost ship was a powerful symbol of helplessness in the face of an uncontrollable epidemic. It represented the ultimate failure, the failure to contain the disease, the failure to find refuge, and the failure to escape death. It was a testament to the brutal, relentless power of the plague, which could turn even a sturdy vessel, a symbol of human ingenuity and resilience, into a silent, haunted tomb, forever drifting on the currents of the ocean. So, as you quietly reflect on the chilling reality of a ghost ship's haunting drift, you truly grasp the horrifying culmination of a plague ship's journey. It was a silent, spectral menace on the open seas, its dead crew and passengers forever sailing on an endless, aimless voyage, a grim and terrifying harbinger of pestilence, carrying its deadly cargo to an uncertain, and often tragic, destiny. You've contemplated the chilling spectacle of a ghost ship, adrift with its dead crew, a silent testament to oceanic horror. Now, let's widen our lens to grasp the broader, devastating impact of these vessels, the plague's global reach. This is about understanding how these horrifying last voyages, far from being isolated tragedies, transformed ships into unwitting vectors for pandemic spread, connecting distant continents and turning localized outbreaks into global catastrophes. Imagine a world before airplanes, before instant communication. The primary arteries of global connection were the sea lanes. Ships carried goods, people, and, crucially, diseases across vast oceans. A vessel departing from a plague-ridden port, or picking up infected individuals or cargo along its journey, became a biological time bomb, carrying the invisible seeds of devastation to far-flung shores. This was how localized epidemics morphed into terrifying pandemics that reshaped continents. Consider the Black Death, the most infamous plague in history. While its exact origins are debated, it is widely believed that the bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rats, spread from Central Asia along trade routes, eventually reaching European port cities via merchant ships. Imagine a ship arriving in Messina, Sicily. In 1347, its crew already dying. The desperate attempt to turn them away was futile. The rats, the fleas, and perhaps even pneumonic plague among the crew, already on board, quickly disembarked, unleashing the full fury of the pestilence upon an unsuspecting populace. Epidemiological consensus firmly establishes that maritime trade routes and infected ships were primary mechanisms for the rapid, long-distance dissemination of historical pandemics, including the Black Death, cholera, and smallpox, before the advent of modern transportation. This underscores the fundamental role of shipping in disease geography. A particularly insidious detail was the long incubation period of many diseases. An individual could board a ship, seemingly healthy, only to develop symptoms days or even weeks later, after the ship had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles. This meant that the virus or bacteria could establish itself within the ship's confined ecosystem, silently spreading among the crew and passengers, before the disease revealed its horrifying presence. By the time the first deaths occurred, the ship might be nearing its destination, unwittingly delivering its deadly cargo. The sheer volume of trade and travel further exacerbated the problem. As global commerce expanded, so did the pathways for disease. Ships laden with exotic goods from distant lands also carried unseen passengers' rats, insects, and contaminated textiles. Imagine a bale of silk, intended for a wealthy merchant, carrying not just luxury, but the very fleas that would unleash a new wave of plague in a bustling European city. Every commodity became a potential vector. Then there was the human factor. Refugees fleeing infected areas, desperate to escape the plague, would crowd onto ships, often unknowingly carrying the disease with them. Imagine a family, sick with smallpox but not yet showing visible symptoms, boarding a vessel bound for a new life, only to bring death to their fellow passengers and, ultimately, to their new home. Their desperate hope became a terrifying engine of contagion. The global spread was also often accelerated by the lack of communication and scientific understanding. News traveled slowly. A port might not know that a distant city was suffering from plague until an infected ship arrived, by which time it was often too late. Without germ theory, the true mechanisms of spread were a mystery, leading to ineffective countermeasures in the rapid, unchecked advance of pandemics across continents. You might see a city close its gates and its harbor, but the invisible killer had already arrived. Disembarked silently from a ship long before, you can trace the devastating path of diseases like cholera across the 19th century, sweeping from India to Europe and then to the Americas. Facilitated almost entirely by maritime traffic, each port city became a new epicenter, rapidly overwhelmed by the incoming contagion from a newly arrived plague ship. The lines on the map that once charted trade routes now charted the relentless advance of death. So, as you quietly reflect on the plague's global reach, you truly grasp how the horrifying last voyages of plague ships were not just isolated tragedies, but fundamental engines of pandemic spread. They silently connected continents with the invisible threads of disease, transforming local outbreaks into global catastrophes, leaving a chilling legacy that continues to remind us of the fragile interconnectedness of our world. Even today, you've contemplated the chilling global reach of plague ships, transforming local outbreaks into devastating pandemics. Now, as our journey through the horrors of these vessels gently draws to a close, let's reflect on their enduring legacy echoes in the modern world. This is about understanding how the brutal lessons learned from plague ships, though seemingly distant, continue to inform our global health policies, international travel regulations, and even our anxieties today, revealing an unbroken thread from historical contagion to contemporary vigilance. Imagine yourself in a bustling international airport or a modern shipping port today. We have sophisticated customs checks, advanced medical screenings, and rapid communication networks that allow information about disease outbreaks to crisscross the globe in seconds. This intricate system of global health security is a direct descendant of the terrifying experiences with plague ships. The very concept of quarantine, for instance, evolved from the desperate, often brutal, measures taken by medieval port cities to isolate plague-ridden vessels. Our modern isolation protocols, travel bans, and health declarations all hark back to the hard-won understanding that contained populations are critical for disease prevention. Consider the role of international health regulations. Organizations like the World Health Organization (WHO) exist precisely because of the historical understanding that a disease outbreak in one part of the world can quickly become a global catastrophe. Just as a single plague ship could bring death to an entire continent, these regulations, which govern everything from disease surveillance to notification protocols and safe travel guidelines, are designed to prevent a return to the uncontrolled spread seen in previous centuries. You probably don't think about them, but these global agreements are the invisible shield protecting you from a repeat of past horrors. Public health and global health historians consistently cite historical pandemics, largely facilitated by maritime travel, as the foundational impetus for the development of international health regulations, epidemiological surveillance, and the establishment of global health organizations. This underscores the direct lineage from plague ships to modern global health security. A particularly fascinating detail is the evolution of port health authorities. In major ports around the world, there are still dedicated officials whose job it is to inspect incoming vessels, monitor for signs of illness among crew and passengers, and ensure compliance with sanitation standards. While vastly more scientific than their medieval counterparts, their fundamental role to act as the gatekeepers against imported disease remains the same. Imagine a modern health inspector, equipped with advanced testing kits, stepping onto a cargo ship, carrying out a duty that has evolved over centuries, but whose core purpose dates back to the first time a city turned away a plague ship. The very design and operation of modern ships also reflect these lessons, while not perfect. Contemporary vessels have vastly improved sanitation systems, better waste disposal, access to clean water, and vastly superior medical facilities compared to their historical counterparts. These are not just about comfort, they are critical public health interventions. Learned from the grim realities of disease spreading like wildfire in confined, unsanitary ship environments, you can also see the echoes in our collective anxiety about global travel and disease, while we enjoy the freedom of international movement. There's an underlying, often subconscious, fear that a new, deadly pathogen could emerge and spread rapidly across borders. This anxiety is a direct legacy of how past pandemics arrived silently by sea, demonstrating that, despite all our advancements, the fundamental vulnerability of interconnectedness remains. The idea of a super spreader event, whether on an airplane or a cruise ship, taps into this deeply ingrained historical memory. The concept of vaccine development and mass immunization campaigns is also profoundly linked to the historical trauma of diseases like smallpox, which were often spread by ships. The relentless search for and rapid deployment of vaccines is a direct response to the devastating impact of infectious diseases that once ravaged populations with little medical intervention. Our collective trust in modern medicine and our drive for global health equity is forged in the crucible of these past horrors. So, as you quietly reflect on the echoes in the modern world, you realize that the horrifying last voyage of a plague ship is not just a distant historical anecdote. It is a powerful, enduring lesson that shaped the very fabric of our interconnected global society. From the design of our cities to our international travel rules and our deepest anxieties, the silent, deadly journeys of those ancient vessels continue to whisper their warnings, ensuring that humanity, hopefully, never again faces such invisible killers with the same profound ignorance and lack of preparation.